The Persistent Mouse by Joan E. Cass. Pictures by Nita Sauter. For Eleanor. Mr. Chisselwick was a very kind-hearted man who was particularly fond of animals. He put out crumbs for the birds and saucers of milk for stray cats, and he even fed the mice. His housekeeper, Mrs. Jones, who came in every day to cook and clean for him, grumbled a lot. "Always letting the mice out of my traps," she said angrily, "and when my back's turned, too." One evening, when Mr. Chisselwick was having his supper, he heard a loud squeak from the pantry. Oh dear, another mouse caught in one of Mrs. Jones' traps. He stole quietly into the pantry. Yes, there was a little brown mouse looking extremely frightened. Somehow he reminded Mr. Chisselwick of his great uncle, Albert Henry. He had the same innocent and gentle expression. "Well, well," said Mr. Chisselwick as he opened the trap. "Come along, Albert Henry. You better run home as fast as you can. If Mrs. Jones finds out what I've been doing, I shall get into dreadful trouble. She does not like mice." Albert Henry vanished like a flash, and Mr. Chisselwick finished his supper. Next morning, when he woke with the sunshine streaming through his bedroom window, he had the strange feeling that he was not alone. He wasn't, for there, sitting by his alarm clock, looking very spruce and friendly, was Albert Henry. His bright eyes, full of silent devotion, were fixed on Mr. Chisselwick's face. At first, Mr. Chisselwick felt quite proud. Then he began to feel rather embarrassed. Albert Henry was so devoted and so persistent. When Mr. Chisselwick went to do his shopping, Albert Henry went too. He would pop up unexpectedly among the groceries or on the counter. Shoppers drew back in alarm. Sometimes they even screamed. The shopkeepers began complaining. They said Albert Henry interfered with business. When Mr. Chisselwick was invited out to lunch or tea, his friends started adding a note at the end of their letters, saying, "Please leave Albert Henry behind." Mr. Chisselwick tried, but Albert Henry invited himself. He did not seem to mind being unwelcome. Mr. Chisselwick began to get rather worried. He decided he would have to have a long day in the country all by himself to think things out. He packed some sandwiches, crept silently out of the house, and went to the station. He felt sure no one had seen him. He caught a train to the country and made himself comfortable in a corner seat. Presently, the carriage began to fill up with people. After a few minutes, everyone in the carriage began looking at him with expressions of alarm and astonishment. Mr. Chisselwick wondered why. Then he felt a cold shiver running down his spine and a tickling around the back of his neck. It was, of course, Albert Henry sitting on his coat collar. Mr. Chisselwick could not bear to stay in the compartment a moment longer, with everyone staring at him. He ate his sandwiches on the platform and took the next train home. "I must really take a long holiday," he said. "If I left for foreign parts, Albert Henry might forget me." He went to a travel agency and came back with lots of booklets full of pictures of coral islands, tree-fringed beaches, and deep blue seas. In the end, he decided he would go on a cruise. He booked his passage on a magnificent ship, bought his ticket, and started to pack. He did this with great care and secrecy, for he did not want Albert Henry to have the least suspicion of what he was planning to do. Mr. Chisselwick got up very early. His bag was ready in the hall. He ate his breakfast stealthily. Albert Henry was nowhere to be seen. He slipped out, caught the train to the docks, and in very short time found himself on board a magnificent liner ready to go to sea. Mr. Chisselwick was shown into a single-berth cabin by a smart steward. It looked very comfortable. He sat down on his bunk with a sigh of relief. Free at last, with not a care in the world, he thought, and 2 whole weeks of glorious travel to enjoy. Then suddenly, without any warning, he felt a strange cold shiver running up and down his spine. Looking wildly round to see who was watching him, he saw, sitting by the porthole, none other than Albert Henry, washing his face and appearing very much at home. The voyage proceeded as planned, and Mr. Chisselwick tried to enjoy himself, which he did quite a lot of the time. At first, he was not too popular with the other passengers. As soon as he started talking to them, he would notice their expressions of amazed surprise. Then he would know Albert Henry wasn't far away. He tried to explain to him how awkward his devotion was proving to be, but Albert Henry didn't seem to understand. One morning, the ship called at a delightful little fishing port. Everyone went on shore to look at the shops, buy postcards, and eat ice cream. Mr. Chisselwick went and sat on the seat overlooking the sea and thought about life, while Albert Henry played in the sand at his feet. Then the ship's siren went. Everyone had to get back on board. Mr. Chisselwick got up slowly and climbed into the little boat that would take them back to the liner. It was getting dark, and the sky had turned pink and gold as the sun sank. Mr. Chisselwick looked back towards the shore. It was difficult to see in the fading light, but as he strained his eyes, he thought he saw Albert Henry, but he wasn't alone. It looked as if he'd found a friend. Was it a lady mouse? Had Albert Henry left him at last? Mr. Chisselwick felt lonely and deserted. The rest of the voyage passed quickly. Mr. Chisselwick enjoyed himself, but he missed Albert Henry. No one had loved him so much before. Mr. Chisselwick had been back in his own home for several months. One day, when he opened his window to let in the morning breeze, he felt that cold, familiar shiver up and down his spine. And there, sitting on the window ledge, was Albert Henry. But he wasn't alone. Beside him was his lady wife and their 6 charming children. Mr. Chisselwick sighed. He did not know whether to be glad or sorry. "Come in, Albert Henry, and bring the family. The place has not been the same since you left."